Somewhere between Portland, Oregon, and a stretch of desert off Interstate 70 in eastern Utah, a 19-year-old girl disappears into a space no one can fully account for. No confirmed route, no confirmed ride, and no clear timeline. Just distance. Hundreds of miles of it. At some point in early 1989, Vicky Lynn Perkins leaves Portland. She's young, unstable footing, moving between places, existing on the edge of systems that don't always keep track of where you go next. And then, she's gone. Weeks later, what's left of her is found in rural Emery County, off the highway, far from home, far from anyone who knew her. No witnesses step forward, no clear explanation follows her there. Just a body placed along one of the most isolated corridors in the American West. And a question that still doesn't have an answer. How does someone travel that far and disappear completely in between? Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning, the series where we return to the crimes rooted deep in the dirt, rock, and snow of the American West. The cases that never really left the communities where they happen. The ones that linger in sheriff's files, in old newspaper archives, and in the quiet memories of people who remember exactly where they were when the news first spread across town. And today, it's just me. Angela and I were not able to line up our schedules this week, and instead of forcing it, rushing it, or even worse, just not putting anything out at all, I made the decision to sit down and record this one solo. Now, I want to be clear about something. Angela isn't just here to fill space. She's not just background noise. She's the voice that asks the questions a lot of you are already thinking. She slows things down when I start moving too fast, and she forces clarity where these cases can get messy. That's important, and you're going to feel that absence a little bit in this episode, but here's the reality of what we're building. Sometimes schedules won't line up. Life happens, and moving forward, instead of leaving you with nothing, you're going to get something like this. A more focused, more stripped down episode, just me walking through a case that deserves attention. So when you hear an episode like this, expectations should shift a little bit. It's not the full back and forth. It's not the same rhythm, but the goal stays the same. To tell the story right, to stay grounded in what we actually know, and to make sure the victim isn't forgotten just because the timing didn't work out. And today, we're talking about a case that has been largely overlooked, even within a series of cases that are already easy to overlook. The story of Vicky Lynn Perkins. Now, before we get into anything about how this happened or who could be responsible, we need to stop and talk about Vicky herself, because this is one of those cases where the record is thin. Not just incomplete, but again, thin. What we can say with confidence is this: Vicky Lynn Perkins was 19 years old. 19. Not someone who'd spent decades drifting through systems, not someone with a long documented history. She was young, still at that point where life hasn't fully settled into anything permanent yet. In early 1989, she was living in Portland, Oregon, and she was struggling. She was using homeless shelters in the area, which tells you that this wasn't just couch surfing or a temporary rough patch. She was in a position where stability just was not there, where day-to-day survival starts to take priority over everything else. And when you're in that position, your world changes. Your routines change. Your safety net shrinks. And the kinds of people that you come in contact with start to shift. Now, at some point during that time, Vicky became involved in sex work, specifically in environments tied to truck stops and interstate travel. And that matters a lot, not because it defines who she was, but because it defines the risk around her, because that world operates totally different. You're dealing with strangers, constant movement, people passing through who don't belong to an area, and interactions that leave very little trace behind. It's a setting where someone can step into your life for a matter of moments and disappear just as quickly. The last confirmed sighting of Vicky places her at a birthday party in the Portland area. And at that party, she tells people something simple but important. She says that she's planning to head to California. That's it. There's no documented reason why. There's no confirmed destination. There's no known person that she was meeting. Just a direction, south. And then after that, there's nothing. There's no confirmed travel. There's no verified sightings along the way. And there's no record of how she got from Portland to anywhere else, which means when we talk about Vicky Lynn Perkins, we're not just dealing with a homicide. We're dealing with a life that in many ways was already slipping through the cracks before she ever even disappeared. That's important because when someone like Vicky goes missing, there's often less documentation. There's fewer witnesses, and there's fewer people in any position to say something's wrong here. Vicky's case fits well this season because, like so many others, it's another one where what isn't known far outweighs what is. And usually, even in the messy ones, you still have something that you can follow. A last phone call, a confirmed ride, a sighting along the way. But here, there isn't. Outside of this season and these stories, usually even the messy ones, you still have something that you can follow. A last phone call, a confirmed ride, a sighting along the way. But in Rocky Mountain Reckoning Season 1, the Great Basin Murders, this case and so many others that we've talked about, there's nothing. The timeline in this case doesn't just have gaps. It has a hole in the middle. We start in Portland. Vicky is last seen at that birthday party in early 1989. She tells people that she's heading south towards California. And then there's nothing. There's no confirmed departure date, no known route, no record of who she left with, if she left with anyone at all. There's no bus ticket. There's no confirmed hitchhiking pickup. No witnesses placing her on Interstate 5 or any of the other major corridors that you'd expect if she was actually heading towards California. And that's important because geographically, this doesn't line up cleanly. If she leaves Portland and heads south, California makes sense. But where she's eventually found, that's not just south, that's southeast, hundreds of miles southeast. And on May 13th, 1989, human remains are discovered in rural Emery County, Utah, near Interstate 70. Remote, sparse, the kind of place where you don't just end up by accident. And by the time she's found, decomposition is advanced. The remains are largely skeletal, which tells you something critical. She'd been there for a while, but how long? We have no idea. There's no clean post-mortem interval that's been publicly documented that gives us any kind of a tight window. So now you're left with two fixed points, Portland in early 1989 and eastern Utah by mid-May. And in between those 2 points, hundreds of miles, multiple states, countless possible routes. There's nothing that you can definitively place her in. There's no confirmed movement, no verified interactions, no timeline to reconstruct. That's what makes this case so difficult because most investigations work by building outward from what you know. But here, the middle is missing. And when that happens, you're not just trying to figure out who did this. You're trying to figure out what the hell happened in the first place, how she traveled, who she encountered, and at what point her path changed from heading somewhere to ending up in a remote stretch of desert off Interstate 70. When we shift from what we don't know to what we do, The picture becomes a little clearer, but only in a very specific way, because the crime scene in this case isn't complex. It's stark. Vicky's body is discovered in eastern Utah, in rural Emery County, near the town of Green River, right off Interstate 70. Not in a structure and not hidden deep in terrain that would take hours to reach. She's found in the brush, just off the shoulder of the eastbound lanes, close enough to the roadway that someone passing through, someone paying attention, could see her, but far enough out of the direct line of travel that she could lay there for weeks, even months, without being noticed. This is a roadside dump site, plain and simple, and the location matters because this stretch of I-70 isn't like all the other interstates. Between Salina and Green River, you're looking at over 100 miles with no services. No gas stations, no towns, no consistent traffic pulling on or off. It's isolated, high desert, open land, low vegetation. The kind of place where if someone pulls over for a few minutes, there's a real chance no one else is going to be around to see it. And that's exactly the kind of environment that this body's found in. When she's discovered, she's nude, and the condition of her remains tell you immediately that this didn't just happen. Her body is highly decomposed, largely skeletal, which places her death not days before her discovery, but weeks, or more likely months. Investigators ultimately determined that this is a homicide and not an ambiguous one. There's evidence of strangulation and beating. This is close contact violence, personal, physical, direct. It's not an accident. It's not exposure. It's not something that just happened out there in the desert. Someone did this. And then they transported her. Because nothing about this location suggests that it's where she lived or where she would have naturally ended up. This is a placement site, a decision point, a place chosen because of what it offers: isolation, distance, and time. Time for a body to break down, time for evidence to degrade, time for the trail to disappear. And by the time she's found, that's exactly what's happened. At this point, we need to stop and ask a different kind of question, not who did this, but what kind of offender does this case actually require? Because like a lot of the cases that we've looked at this season so far, there's a tendency to immediately place something like this into a larger pattern. Interstate, transient victim, body found off a remote stretch of highway. It feels like it belongs to something bigger. But feeling like a pattern and proving a pattern aren't the same thing. So let's strip this down to what we actually have. A 19-year-old woman living in an unstable situation, moving through shelters, involved in sex work tied to truck stops and highway environments. That alone puts her in repeated contact with strangers, people passing through, people who don't belong to the area, people who can disappear just as easily as they arrived. And in that kind of an environment, you don't need a serial offender to explain what happened. One encounter is enough. One person with a vehicle, one person willing to use control and violence, one person who knows how to leave a body where it won't be found right away. That explains this case completely. But at the same time, when you look at how this plays out, it also lines up with something that we've already been talking about, because this isn't random in structure. She's encountered in a transient-based environment. She's definitely moved by vehicle. The violence is close contact, strangulation, beating, and her body is left just off an interstate corridor in a place chosen for isolation and distance. That combination is important because it's not just possible, it's consistent. And that's where someone like Clark Perry Baldwin comes into the conversation, not as a conclusion, as a comparison. Because when you look at how he operated, long haul trucking, interstate movement, contact with vulnerable women in transient settings, control inside a vehicle, strangulation, and the body's left just off the highway, the overlap is real, but overlap isn't proof. Because even with that alignment, there's no confirmed connection between him and Vicky. There's no forensic link. There's no interaction. There's no placement that ties him to this specific moment in time. And then when you look at someone like Scott William Cox, you see a different kind of fit. Still strong, but from a different direction. Cox was Portland-based. He drew victims from the sex trade. The encounters happened inside vehicles. All of that aligns closely with where Vicky starts, but less cleanly with where she ends up, because his known cases tend to stay closer to urban or semi-urban environments, not a remote stretch of interstate in eastern Utah. So what you're left with is this: 3 possibilities. A structured, mobile offender operating across highway systems, an opportunistic offender tied to the environment that she was already in, or a single encounter that never repeats. And based on what we actually know, all 3 are still on the table. This case doesn't force an answer. It leaves you in the overlap where the pattern is there, but the proof isn't. Now, because of where we are at in this season, we need to address a name that has come up before, and it's going to come up more and more as we move forward, and that is Clark Perry Baldwin. So I want to be clear about how we're handling this. We are going to break him down in detail in the very soon upcoming episodes, because this piece of shit deserves that level of attention. But here, we're not going to do a full profile. We're asking a simpler question. Does he fit this case? And when you look at the surface structure, there are some things that line up. Baldwin was a long-haul truck driver. He operated across multiple states. He had access to the exact kinds of environments that we're talking about: interstates, truck stops, transient populations. And in the cases that he is connected to, the pattern includes contact with vulnerable women in transit, control inside a vehicle, close contact violence, including strangulation, and bodies left near highways, often just off the roadway. So when you take all of that and you lay it next to Vicky's case, a young woman exposed to interstate environments, definitely vehicle-based movement, strangulation and beating, and a body left just off I-70 in a remote area, there is overlap, real overlap. But this is where we have to stay disciplined, because overlap isn't evidence. There are also differences. Baldwin's known victims tend to come from hitchhiking or travel-based encounters, women actively moving along those routes. Vicky's exposure appears to be more tied to sex work environments around truck stops. Now, those worlds definitely intersect, but they're not identical. And that matters when you're trying to understand how initial contact happens. And the other thing is timing. The cases tied to Baldwin that we can actually prove fall in the early 1990s, 1991 into 92. Vicky's killed in 89. So the question becomes, is that part of the same behavioral window, or is it outside of what we can confidently place him in? And right now, there's no clear answer to that, because by the time Baldwin shows up in confirmed cases, his method is already established, which raises the very real possibility that he was active much earlier. But again, possibility isn't proof. And that's the line that we just don't cross. So where does that leave us? Baldwin is a viable comparison. He fits the structure. He fits the environment. He fits the type of access that would be required. But there is no direct link tying him to Vicky Lynn Perkins. There's no forensic connection. There's no confirmed interaction, no placement in this case. So for now, he stays exactly where he belongs in this episode. Relevant, but unproven. Which brings us to another name that comes up in this case. And it comes up from a different direction. Scott William Cox. Now, unlike Baldwin, Cox is directly tied to Portland, which is important because that's where Vicky's story begins. Cox lived and operated outside of the Portland area, and the victims that he's known to be connected to come from the same general environment Vicky was moving through. Women involved in the sex trade, women in unstable situations, women who are already interacting with strangers as part of survival. And his method starts in a way that would look completely normal from the outside. The contact is voluntary, a ride, a transaction, an agreement. And then once the person is inside the vehicle, everything changes. Control, violence, close contact assault. So when you look at Vicky's starting point, Portland, in shelters, truck stop environments, sex work tied to interstate movement, that overlap with Cox is immediate. But just like with Baldwin, you have to carry this all the way through because where this case ends doesn't fit Cox cleanly. Vicky isn't found in Portland. She's not found in a nearby area. She's not even found in the same state. She's found hundreds of miles away off a remote stretch of Interstate 70 in eastern Utah. That's important because Cox, at least based on what we can confirm, tends to operate closer to his base. His known cases don't show the same kind of long distance interstate disposal pattern that we see here. They're quicker, closer, less dependent on remote terrain. So what you end up with is a split. Cox fits the beginning of Vicky's story, the environment, the victim type, the point of contact, but he doesn't fit the end. The distance, the isolation, the disposal location. And just like Baldwin, there's no direct link, no forensic connection, no confirmed interaction, no evidence placing him in this case. So again, what you have is relevance, not proof. When you step back from all of this, what you're left with isn't a clean answer. It's a range of possibilities that all fit the evidence in different ways. Now that's uncomfortable because cases like this make people want to choose. They want to say, this was a serial offender or this was a one-time encounter. But the reality is this case doesn't force that decision. Everything that we've walked through, Vicky's life, her exposure, the environments that she was moving through, the way that she likely encountered someone, the violence, the transport, the placement of her body along a remote stretch of interstate, all of that tells you something important. This was not random chaos. There is structure here. There's control. There's decision-making. But structure doesn't automatically mean repetition. And that's the line that matters because a person can do this once and never do it again. Or they can do it multiple times across multiple states without ever being connected. And based on what we actually know, we can't say which one this is. What we can say is this. Vicky Lynn Perkins was in a position where she was repeatedly exposed to risk. Not because of who she was, but because of the environments that she had to move through to survive. And in one of those moments, she crossed paths with someone who had the ability and the willingness to take control of that situation, to move her, to kill her, and to leave her in a place where time, distance, and isolation would do the rest. Whether that person did it before or did it again after, that's part of this case that still sits unanswered. And that's where it stays, because without a direct connection, without evidence that ties this to a known offender, this case doesn't belong to a theory. It belongs to her. And the fact that decades later, we still don't know who was responsible. There's something about this song that sits in the quiet spaces, not loud, not overwhelming, just present. The song The Hollow Hour carries that feeling of absence, of something missing, of a voice that should be there but isn't. It's about the space left behind, the echo, and the weight of knowing that something real, something human has been reduced to silence. And when you look at Vicky's case, that's exactly what it feels like. A life we only see in fragments, moments that we can't fully reconstruct, and a story that just stops, leaving behind questions that never get answered, and a presence that should still be here. This is The Hollow Hour by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Vicky Lynn Perkins. Vicky Lynn Perkins was 19 years old, just 19. An age where most people are just starting to figure out who they are, where they're going, what their life is going to look like. And for Vicky, that path was not easy. She was living in Portland, moving through shelters, trying to get by in a situation that didn't offer much stability. But she was still moving forward, still making plans, still talking about what came next. At that birthday party, she told people that she was heading south, towards California, towards something different. And whether that was a fresh start, a new opportunity, or just the next step, it meant she was still looking ahead. She was still trying. And that matters because too often, people in situations like hers get reduced to mere labels, reduced to circumstances, reduced to the environment that they're in, instead of being seen for what they are, a person in motion, a person trying to move forward, even when things aren't working right. And somewhere between Portland and that stretch of desert off Interstate 70, that movement stopped. Not because she chose it, but because someone else made that decision for her. Someone who saw vulnerability and took advantage of it. Someone who had the ability to control the situation and did. And for decades now, that person has never been held accountable. Her case remains unsolved. Her story remains incomplete, but that does not mean that she disappears. Because even without all the details, even without the full picture, we still know enough to say this: she was here, she lived, she mattered, and she deserved more than what happened to her. She deserved safety, she deserved time, she deserved the chance to become whatever it was that she was working towards, instead of being frozen in a moment that someone else created. And while we may not have all the answers, while the middle of her story is still missing, we can still do one thing right. We can say her name, we can tell her story, and we can make sure that she is not just another case file sitting under dust somewhere, but is a person who is remembered. That person was Vicky Lynn Perkins.
If this is where the meaning hides, the dark divides. In the hollow